Hello and welcome to the Forge of Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Alex Ooley, and this is episode 170 of the Forge of Freedom. At the Forge of Freedom, we take time to explore ideas about liberty, responsibility, and what it means to live freely in today's world. On this episode, we're turning our attention to a subject that often stirs strong feelings. What does it mean to be responsibly armed? Rather than getting caught up in the usual debates, our goal is to forge understanding, one conversation at a time. And there's no better guide for that than our guest today, Dr. David Yamane. Professor Yamane's story is an interesting one. He's a self-described liberal sociology professor at Wake Forest University, raised in a gun-free home, who once saw himself as an outsider in the world of firearms. But about 13 years ago, Professor Yamane stepped into a firing range for the first time, and less than 2 years later, he was scoring 290 out of 300 in a stressful shooting qualification. And over the next 13 years, he logged more than 500 hours of firearms training across 10 states. That's Professor Yamane's journey, chronicled in his book, Gun Curious, a liberal professor's surprising journey inside America's gun culture. Today, we're zeroing in on Chapter 8, titled Being Responsibly Armed, where he unpacks what it takes to carry a gun with skill, ethics, and purpose. But we're not stopping there. We'll also wrestle with a philosophical critique from Michael Austin's article, Virtue and Guns, which Professor Yamane engages with in the chapter, asking whether America's gun culture builds character or tears it down. Professor Yamane brings a unique perspective. Through his blog, Gun Culture 2.0, and years of firsthand experience, he's observed a shift in the culture around firearms. He's trained with respected instructors and thought deeply about what responsibility looks like in this context. In our conversation, we'll hear about his experiences, his thoughts on training and ethics, and how he responds to critiques like Austin's. It's a chance to step back and consider what being responsibly armed really means, whether you're familiar with guns or just curious about the discussion. Professor Yamane, thanks for joining the Forge of Freedom.
Alex, thanks so much for having me and for that incredible introduction. I hope that what follows can live up to it.
Well, I, as you may recall, we met um, a number of years ago, actually, and you may not recall that part. In 2019, you were speaking at the NRA annual meeting in Indianapolis at the luncheon during the firearms law seminar, and I was in attendance as an attorney, and you were speaking to the lunch crowd there, and it was the first time I'd heard about you and heard about your work in the Gun Culture 2.0 uh, research that you were involved in, and I was just so gripped by your presentation during lunch, which sounds strange that one of the most memorable parts about that day was your luncheon presentation, but that says a lot about I think the unique perspective that you bring to the topic. And then, of course, last year we met again in Dallas at the NRA annual meeting once again, where you were speaking at the luncheon there as well. So I've always admired what you're doing, your work, and of course, most recently you came out with your book, Gun Curious. So with that background in mind, if you would share with the audience a little bit about how you arrived at this most recent project, what got you into the firearms realm, how does a liberal sociology professor get into firearms, and what led you to Gun Curious?
Yeah. Well, I think the subtitle, "Liberal Professor's Surprising Journey Inside America's Gun Culture," probably the biggest surprise was that I journeyed inside of gun culture at all, because I spent 42 years of my life, perfectly happily living completely outside of gun culture. It wasn't anything I really thought of or worried about, and until I kind of came to North Carolina, and then the liberal bubble that insulated me from guns started to break down little by little, so that in 2011 I did go to the range and try shooting guns for the first time. Not really because I was interested in getting into guns, but really because I thought a lot of people have these things. I don't know how they work. I want to know how they work. I want to know how to unload them or see if they're safe. So, that became a really big turning point because I really enjoyed that experience. The idea that there's no such thing as an anti-gun gun range was true in my case. So I kind of became a gun owner shortly after that. And then I also pivoted in my research to studying guns professionally as a sociologist. And that's really where the Gun Curious book came from. I spent from 2012 until 2024, when I sort of submitted the final manuscript for the book, uh, just trying to understand all aspects of gun culture with a particular focus on what I call gun culture 2.0, the defensive kind of core of contemporary gun culture. And that National Firearms Law Seminar that we met at, the 2019 and 2024 were kind of bookends to this project because I was really just doing an academic study of gun culture. I did talk about my personal experiences, especially on my blog, but I was, publishing academic articles and essays and book reviews. But when they asked me to speak during lunch at a firearms law seminar, I said, I better bring something interesting here because nobody wants to hear me doing an academic lecture about guns over lunch. And I decided to really take a pretty strongly personal angle and tell the story of gun culture from my own perspective, getting into it and the lessons I learned. And the reception was honestly so much better than I could have expected that I pivoted away from publishing an academic book about guns to this Gun Curious book, which also, like that presentation, really takes a strong personal narrative orientation to the work. At the same time, I'd also try to bring in broader empirical observations, but it really tells the story from my own perspective. So then when they invited me back in 2024, it was right when the book was launching, and I was able to sort of summarize where I had been in the 5 years in between. So those are really pivotal moments for me.
So last late spring, early summer, Gun Curious was released, but you'd been working on this project, the Gun Curious book and Gun Culture 2.0. And obviously we're going to dive a little more deeply into chapter 8 about being responsibly armed. And I'll just say you've done a number of podcasts about the book, and I'll link to some of those in the show notes for people who are more interested in a broad discussion about your book. But before we dive into chapter 8, if you would just talk a little bit about the concept of gun culture 2.0, because we've talked about that a little bit here already, but I think that may be a bit of a foreign
Mm-hmm.
word or concept to lots of folks. And if you would, I'm sure you will, but harken back to where that phrase comes from.
Yeah. Well, right after I got into guns personally, I was trying to learn as much as I could about them. I literally knew nothing about firearms the first time I shot. And so before felt like I could buy a gun, I needed to learn about different gun types and different calibers and what would be a good gun for a beginner. I started reading magazines and books and then also listening to podcasts. And one day I was listening to Michael Bain's podcast, and he started talking about this thing he called Gun Culture 2.0, which was a defensively oriented gun culture, a newer aspect of gun culture, even though obviously self-defense has always been a part of gun culture, but one focused on gun training and concealed carry and bringing new gun owners into the fold. And I was listening to him talking. I was like, this is really describing almost exactly my experience, And so I thought, I'm not just kind of personally becoming interested in guns, I'm actually becoming involved in this thing called Gun Culture 2.0. So then when I started a blog in 2012, I called it Gun Culture 2.0. I had never met Michael before. And I just kind of took the idea. I always tried to give him credit, but I remember meeting him at the NRA meeting in Louisville for the first time. Someone made an introduction, and I said, "Hi, my name is David Yamane. I stole your idea of Gun Culture 2.0 from my blog. I'm really sorry." And he was very delightful, and he was like, "I'm very happy that somebody finds it useful, and please run with it." And he's always been a good a friend and a supporter of my work. But the idea really captures this notion that guns have always been a part of American history. They've always been a part of human history. As for that matter, I talk about that in one of the chapters. But in America, it's always been a part of our history and our culture. But the way people sort of interact with and live with guns can change over time, different accents. And so, very practically oriented at the start, like very tool-like, evolving into a sort of more recreational and sporting culture. I call gun culture 1.0. So hunting, recreational, shooting, competition, collecting. And then since the 1960s, really developing much more strongly toward armed self-defense as the core of American gun culture, even though all of those other emphases still exist within gun culture. And for many people, like, you and I probably own, guns for many different reasons, right? So, but that's where that idea of gun culture 2.0 comes in. I think it's a useful sort of heuristic device to understand the evolution of American gun culture to get us to where we are today.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting observation just in its own right, but I think it's also useful for folks who have been more ingrained in the firearms world, who wonder why we can't reach new people. And I think it helps to inform, how to reach new people. Why are people coming to, to the gun range, or why might they have an interest in firearms? And so I think that it really helps to inform people who are already engaged in the firearms culture, to help them engage with new people who are coming into the fold.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I think that it is definitely the case that a lot of the new people who are buying firearms are definitely interested in self-defense, and so that's just a piece of evidence for that. Not that, again, if they never train, if they don't enjoy shooting, they may not stay gun owners for long, or the gun may just go in a drawer somewhere. So, owning a gun and being a part of the culture, are almost kind of two separate things. But those are opportunities to grow the culture, that grow the practices and activities around something that we enjoy and that we think is important.
So let's get into chapter 8, being responsibly armed. And as I mentioned earlier, you've done a number of podcasts about your book, Gun Curious, and I'll link to a number of those in the show notes. But I love the way you start out chapter 8 with a quote that myself and my father use frequently when we are teaching a basic handgun course. Uh, you are no more armed because you are wearing a pistol than you are a musician because you own a guitar. And I think that really speaks to people. It helps to emphasize that this is not, it doesn't necessarily carry with it the responsibility that comes with owning a firearm, but it at least conveys the message that this is not something you can just pick up and use, at least use in a way that's maybe a successful use of it, or in a
Yeah.
safe use of it. But if you would unpack that quote for us, and what does that quote mean to you?
Yeah, I think it's very easy for somebody to acquire a material object, and it's a lot harder to be a proficient user of that object. And I know that, again, speaking for a lot of new gun owners, we don't have a lot of experience with firearms prior to becoming gun owners. If you were raised in a gun owning household, you start learning the rules of gun safety before you ever use a firearm unsupervised, right? There's this very progression of this, being safe around guns, and then being introduced to actually shooting guns under direct supervision, and then kind of graduating to more independent uses of firearms. Well, if you're a 42-year-old adult like me, you go to the range one time, a guy shows you how to shoot, you enjoy it, and you go out and buy a gun. Right? So I'm a gun owner before I'm actually a responsibly armed person. I'm a risk averse person. I'm a cautious person, but I'm not familiar with firearms, the manual of arms, how to use them, how to live with them safely. right? And so, I was a gun owner, but I wouldn't say that I was a responsibly armed citizen until much later when I took the opportunity to become better trained, better educated, and practice more with firearms. So I was like someone who goes out and buys a drum set and just starts hammering on those drums, but it's very far from a drummer. Although, as you mentioned, it's a lot safer to hammer on a drum than to accidentally drop the hammer on a loaded gun that you think is unloaded, like I actually did in my apartment one time. So I think it's very serious.
Well, there's this mentality among some folks, and you encounter it with some relative degree of frequency. I wouldn't say that it's common necessarily or the norm, but they say you don't see this in basic firearms courses or people who uh, refrain from going to basic firearms training courses that I've been shooting a gun since I was a little kid, or I don't need that. My daddy taught me how to shoot, or I just bought this firearm at such and such place, and it's got a great trigger and sights. I don't need any training. And that sort of mentality, like I said, is not, I wouldn't say the norm, but it is out there. And I think that this quote really speaks to that sort of person. Just because you bought the device, whether it be the guitar or the drum set or the firearm, doesn't make you a skilled marksman, a or a responsibly armed citizen.
And the fact that this quote at least is often attributed to Jeff Cooper, so this suggests that this is not a new idea. This isn't related to all of the new gun owners coming into gun ownership today. He's probably talking in the 60s or 70s when he says that for the first time, if it
Yeah.
was actually him. But this is an old idea. So the issue of training and being responsibly armed is not new to gun culture.
So the next thing that you dive into a little bit, which I thought was really interesting, you link to this, and I love the citations that you provide in your book. This is an argument from, or a critique from Michael Austin, Virtue and Guns, and it's at blanking on the name of the blog, the Psychology Today
Yeah.
Ethics for Everyone blog. And if you would summarize the argument that he makes there about basically the harm that he sees from gun culture and gun culture 2.0 specifically.
Yeah, I was very surprised when I saw this. I knew of him a little bit because he does sort of philosophy of religion, and I used to study the sociology of religion. But I would get Google alerts whenever anybody used the term gun culture 2.0 in on that the Google would catch. So when I saw it come across, I was like, oh wow, someone is writing in Psychology Today about gun culture 2.0. That's pretty cool. So I looked at it and I was like, well, this is not actually so cool because I think that this is someone who has very strong sort of ethical beliefs about firearms and about killing, but doesn't really know anything practically about this world. So, he really argued from an ethical perspective that gun culture 2.0, because of its defensive focus, really means the possibility of taking another human's life, and that some of the gun training that he saw was designed specifically to reduce a kind of inherent human resistance to taking human life, and so that in connection with that, basically, uh, gun training, defensive gun training, makes people less empathetic. They care less about human beings and human life. And I just said, I was probably only halfway through my research at that point, maybe 5 or 6 years in, and I had observed probably dozens of hours of gun training at that point, maybe not the hundreds that I've gotten to. But I just said that's not what I see at all. And so I asked for the opportunity to write a response, and he immediately agreed. I sent him what I thought, and he ran it, as I wrote it. So I thought it ended up being a nice exchange. But I thought that there were some very clear problems with his argumentation about defensive gun culture.
Yeah, and I had, by the time I'd read your book, um, I'd been through a lot of the same training that you had, particularly Mag 40 with Massad Ayoob, and we'll get to that in more depth here in just a little bit. But that was not my experience at all after having gone through the training with Massad Ayoob and Mag 40, because the focus there is really puts priority on the value of human life, and really emphasizes that the use of deadly force is a last resort and one that you should avoid if at all possible. Now, there is some in training. Part of what we do is try to develop some automaticity. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but basically you want the function, the marksmanship, the gun handling, the use of the firearm to become second nature, so that you have the mental capacity to deal with the problem at hand and make the judgment about whether or not it's proper to use deadly force or some other degree of force or no force. And so there is, as he says, it makes the training makes it fosters reflexive shooting, I think was the way he
Yeah.
put it, through training. And that's true to some degree, but it's really just about the gun handling and the marksmanship, not about the decision itself about whether to use force.
Yeah.
And so I think my impression was that his argument had a lot of built-in assumptions about what the training actually was, not having been through the training himself. Is
Yes.
that
Yeah.
is that a
Yeah. And
fair
he,
character?
he uses this example of something you found online, the rolling thunder drill, where, you're shooting, and typically shotguns is when I've seen it, but, you just kind of go down the line and you shoot after the person in front, next to you shoots. And, this is just a way of practicing, the technical skills that you need to use a firearm. It doesn't condition you in any way like, oh, someone shot something, I should shoot now. It doesn't desensitize you to the value of human life. It doesn't really do any of those things. And but by contrast, as you said, the less you have to use your brain capacity to figure out how to use a firearm, the more you can think yourself through the complexities of a self-defense situation. And I was fortunate to, through my training, to meet a lot of very, high level shooters, and even some military operators. And, they practice shooting all the time, not so that they could automatically shoot someone, but so that they don't automatically shoot someone. Right. And so, I thought that it was problematic. Argument for him, and he never, I don't think, as far as I know, he ever responded to mine, but I feel like I won a couple rounds there.
I didn't. I actually searched to see if I could find a response, and I didn't find one in preparation for this episode. So at least as of March 3rd, 2025, it doesn't seem like there's been a response or a rebuttal
Yeah.
uh, to your response. But I thought it was a great exchange, nevertheless, and of course I'll link to that in the
Right.
show notes as well.
And as you said, also, I think it needs to be reiterated, that every gun training class that I've took sort of placed a strong emphasis on the value of human life. That there was, they're practical, they're legal, but there are also ethical dimensions to the use of lethal force. And all of the classes that I attend really emphasize that ethical side of it. That this is a very important decision, right? But you also, in making that decision, are defending life. So it's not, you're not doing it for no reason. You're doing it because you value life. You value your own life, or the life of your family, or innocent other people that you're protecting. So there's a broader, I think, kind of liberal orientation to these guns in general, which is that there's no such thing as pro-social violence, right? All violence is bad. And again, I think if you become a serious defensive gun owner, then you're by definition saying, actually, all violence isn't bad, right? There's some violence that is done, for personal good or for the greater good.
Yeah, so oftentimes, and I'm just hearkening back to some training that I've done recently with Ed Monk, who teaches about active shooter response, and he talks about again and again that sometimes the only good response to violence is equally or greater amount of violence to stop the initial violent act. So none of it's good, but it's the better of the two situations, where the innocent potential victim acts violently to stop the violent attacker. So, um, yeah, maybe the 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 outcome is better, still not good, but that's part of the training too. Is that why these situations should be avoided if possible.
Yeah.
Um, so, with that in mind, let's get into to that a little bit. You chronicle a lot of the training that you went through in Chapter 8, and really sort of it shows a sort of the evolution or the way that you came about thinking what it means to be responsibly armed. So, if you would walk us through that, what does being responsibly armed mean to you, and how did you sort of formulate your view on responsible gun ownership?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think sort of generally, responsible gun ownership means being safe with your firearms and keeping your firearms safe from people who shouldn't have access to them. So that's a kind of basic level. But I think in terms of being a responsible defensive firearms owner, again, I think there's a practical dimension to that. There's a legal dimension to that, and then there's an ethical dimension to that. And so, in my kind of evolution, again, going from someone who really owned a firearm before I knew what to do with firearms, I really wanted to sort of rectify that. And I was fortunate that I was able to kind of jointly pursue my personal interest in guns alongside my academic research. So, one of the first major trainings I went to was Masada Ayoub's Mag 40, and I actually had a grant from Wake Forest University to travel to take that class. I went to the Range Master Tactical Conference that Wake Forest paid for that trip, and so, I was fortunate to be able to double dip in those cases. But the goal was always to say, hey, I'm new to this. I don't know anything, but who knows, right? Who are the people out there who really know what they're talking about? And so, then it's fairly easy for someone like Masada Ayub to rise to the top, or someone like Tom Givens to rise to the top. And so I was always going to these, sometimes just observing, sometimes participating and observing, but always trying to figure out, hey, if I want to own firearms for self-defense, what do I need to know, and what do I have to be able to do? And that was the underlying process of figuring out personally what to do. And then in laying it out in that chapter, I definitely left out quite a few people who I was fortunate to learn from, but I wanted to sort of focus on fewer people over a larger space so that people could get more of a feel of the texture. Because I had hoped people like, Michael Austin would read that book and say, "Oh, that's what it looks like." He's never going to go to gun training, but at least he can see what gun training actually, high level gun training actually looks like.
Yeah, yeah. I was For that reason, I was glad that you chronicled a lot of your firearms training experience in this chapter. And speaking of that, you mentioned um, a New York Times opinion essay by Harold Shapira. I hope I'm saying that name
Yeah,
correctly, where he says that the defensive gun training courses not only teach students to shoot without thinking, but also to avoid legal consequences. If you would contrast that statement or that assertion with your experience at Mag 40,
yeah. Well, I
or
think
other training for that matter.
sure. No,
Yeah.
it's kind of like Michael Austin 2.0, right? He's
Mhm.
making some of the very same arguments. Now, in his defense, Harrell actually did go and do gun training. He actually spent a good bit of time with Carl Wren at KR Training in Central Texas, because Harrell was at the University of Texas in Austin. Um, Carl's not very happy about the way his training is being portrayed by Harrell, understandably. But yeah, some of those things that, again, that notion that you're just being trained to shoot reflexively, right? I think is something that I found almost never to be the case. And even kind of before that, of awareness, avoidance, and then action if necessary. So that the action always being a sort of last resort. So not, I think that it's kind of like that shoot first and ask questions later mentality that gun owners are often accused of having, which I find, it's always shoot last, right? It's figure out what your options are, use other non-lethal options if you have them. If you don't have any other options, then yes, you by all means use lethal force if you have to. So that reflexive shooting thing, is, I think, just wrong. And then in the escaping legal consequences, knowing what the law says and knowing what you can legally do and not do is not at all trying to escape legal consequences, right? If you use lethal force, justifiably in self-defense and you're acquitted or not charged, that's not escaping legal consequences. That's being on the right side of the law. So again, I think there's this broader idea that there's no good uh, use of lethal force in self-defense. There's no good violence, right? There's no appropriate violence. There's no justifiable violence. And again, if someone is truly a pacifist, I know a couple people who are legitimately true pacifists. They would never use force to defend themselves. But I don't know that Harel Shapira is one of those people. I think that if someone attacked his son, he would probably want to be able to use violence if he has a son. That was hypothetical, right? If someone he loves, maybe he wouldn't defend himself, but I would think that something would rise up in him that would lead him to want to try to defend, one of his loved ones if they were attacked. So yeah, I think again, I was sad to see that New York Times editorial. He's supposed to be coming out with a book based on his experiences doing this research. It's been delayed, and I don't know the status of it because I'm not really in touch with him. But I had thought when he wrote that editorial, it said his book was coming out in the summer of 24. So I said, oh, good. Our books will come out at the same time. And then people can sort of look at them side by side. But his book has not seen the light of day yet. And I don't know why.
Well, I could see somebody like Harel saying, if I said to him, one of the things or some of the things that I learned at Mag 40 were, what do I say on the 911 call? How do I talk to, or what do I say to responding officers? What do I say to investigating officers? What do I say to my attorney? Those all sound like things to try to avoid legal consequence. Uh, how would you square that with what Harel is saying? That this is, he's just teaching you how to get out of jail free script, so to speak. After you've used deadly force.
Yeah. Well, I think Moss's perspective always is like if you have used lethal force against someone and you cannot reasonably demonstrate that you were in fear of your life, then you have broken the law, right? And he takes all kinds of questions about what if I shoot someone out on my porch and then I drag him inside? That question comes up so often. And I don't know where that question comes from, but every legitimate trainer I've ever seen has just said, don't do that. That's against the law. Like if you are, innocent, then you can honestly express to someone why you reasonably felt like you were in fear of death or grave bodily injury. So, knowing the law, like if someone is trying to understand what is the law around voting or what is the law around anything that we do, no one claims that knowing the law is a way of skirting the law. And I think that it's bad. It's a measure of bad faith that a lot of people have in gun owners, that they think that gun owners aren't acting in good faith. And that's where that criticism comes from. But from the lowest level concealed carry class that I've taken to the highest level, multi-day gun training course, there's never been any sense of here's how you get away with murder. And a lot of times these cases will come up. The young man who was shot in Kansas City when he was looking for his brother, he went up on the porch and the guy shot him through the screen door. And people are like, aha, see, gun owners are just, shoot first and ask questions later. And I said, well, I mean, this guy, I don't know all the facts, but it appears that he violated the law. And, a court will determine whether he violated the law. And as it turns out, he pleaded guilty to violating the law. So, it wasn't like he could just claim self-defense or castle doctrine or stand your ground, which didn't even apply because he was in his home. You can't just say, you know, I invoke castle doctrine, therefore I can shoot somebody. Like, that's not how things work.
Yeah.
The guy who shot the kids who drove on his driveway in New York, he's going down. The guy who killed Jordan Davis at the Jacksonville gas station, he's in jail for murder. Like, just because people assert self-defense doesn't mean that's a free pass.
Yeah. And it ignores it. It takes kind of a myopic view of the training. And going back to a point that you made earlier, it almost presumes that there is no good act, no ethical act of violence. And it ignores the, dealing with the aftermath, or talking to somebody like Harrell about the aftermath and the training about what you should or how you should approach the aftermath, ignores the hours of training that took place beforehand about what elements have to be present to justifiably use force, right?
Yeah.
And so if you look at it that way, or I should say, if you look at just the aftermath and ignore the justifiable use of force part of the training, then I could see somebody taking that out of context.
Yeah. And, I would say also that there's a lot of people who focus appropriately on the legal dimensions, like under what conditions could you legally use lethal force in self-defense. But there are people like Masada Ayub, Tom Givens, John Correa. I can't think of anybody who doesn't say this, as it's not just a question of whether you can legally do this or not. It's also an ethical question that goes beyond whether you can legally do something or not. Is this something that you have to do? Like, can you avoid even getting to that point? If you can, you should. And so, that's why I say this, practically, how do we use firearms? How do we have good marksmanship skills, gun handling skills? And then, what can we legally do? But then always that question of what can you ethically do?
Yeah. What the can versus should question, right? Yeah. What legally can I do versus what should I do? And as you say, all the training that I've been to, the should question is really emphasized. Just because I can doesn't mean I should.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Can, and even some people throw in must, right? Can, should, must, right?
Must.
Right. Just this
exactly.
is, I don't
think that's
have a
John
choice.
Correa. I think he's the one that I've at least heard that from.
Yeah.
Must I use deadly force in self-defense?
Right.
You talk a little bit about mindset and the combat mindset in particular, and you alluded to Jeff Cooper's. We actually began talking about his quote, but he was, for those who don't know, he was the founder of Gunsight, and he talked a lot about this combat mindset. Could you talk a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, I think, and this is, I'm not 100% comfortable with the combat mindset term, because I think it kind of creates this sense of this is some sort of military battle that we're in, and I think most civilian gun carriers don't enter their everyday life with a mindset of like, I'm going to war right now. But I think it is the mindset that you should have if you are going to carry a firearm or own a firearm for self-defense, that you may have to use lethal force, and you need to be prepared for that. And that being prepared in that sense of the being ready for it before the time comes, I think is significant to be able to handle the stress of the situation, to be able to make that decision in a legal and ethical manner. And so as I think that aspect of the combat mindset is something that all civilian defensive gun owners should have. But I also talk about an encounter I had with Paul Howe, the Delta Force operator who was in Black Hawk Down, and talking to him about his view of combat mindset, which is really, you got to be the kind of person who's going to run toward danger. And I was like, well, I don't know if I'm that kind of person. And he's like, that's okay. Not everybody is that kind of person. Like, and that's not your responsibility as a civilian gun owner, right? You're not out there trying to solve other people's problems, right? You're trying to get yourself home safe. And I think that that's a good modality, right? And Cooper, given his military background, he sometimes plays up that military side of things. But I think that even one of his students, like Gabe Suarez, who also has a very kind of aggressive approach, to the right to self-defense, also in his classes, teaches people the same kinds of avoidance and awareness, and using the gun as a last resort, but being mentally prepared to use the gun if that point comes.
Yeah, I like how you sort of qualified that in your book that this is eh, carrying a firearm every day as a civilian is not the same as combat. And you illustrated that a little bit through you told a story about, I think it was Travis Haley, about how his views had changed since he'd made the Magpul videos numbers of years ago. Obviously, talked about the encounters that he had in combat as well, and about how you know taking another human's life is such a monumental decision to make that it really, you can't emphasize enough how much it should be a last resort, even when, as we were saying earlier, you may be legally justified in doing so.
Right.
um,
I
but I
mean,
love how you, oh, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, these are, like I had said, I have good fortune to have spent some time around people like Travis Haley, Paul Howe, Mike Pannone, another Delta Force veteran, uh, and all of them are like, you don't want to kill anybody. Like, if there's anybody in this class or anybody they're talking to who is like anxious to kill somebody, it's like you're either a fool or you're a psychopath or a sociopath. Like, that they are not training people how to kill people or that they should kill people. They're like, it's terrible, right?
Yeah,
And it's something that they do and they have to do, but it's not anything that you should want to do.
right. One of the things that you discuss in the mindset aspect is having a robust toolkit, or a robust set of options for defensive purposes. And because, right, you talk about if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail,
Yes.
right? Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, that was something that I heard quite a few different people say. John Murphy, especially, emphasizes this, the hills and the complete combatant. But there is such a focus in defensive firearms training, apparently, I guess appropriately so, on the firearm because it's in the name, that it can be forgotten that that's a tool of last resort, and the more options that you have prior to getting to that tool, the better off you probably are. Again, with under the assumption that you are not looking to kill anybody, you're just looking to get yourself and your family home at night or wherever you happen to be. So, I think that idea of the toolkit was really important for me to understand. Saying like, okay, the gun is a tool. Your telephone is a tool, right? A tourniquet is a tool. A flashlight is a tool. A knife is a tool. Right? We have such a broad range of things that we can use. A pepper spray, to intervene between I'm completely defenseless and I have to use a firearm. And the more you have, intervening between those two things, I think between a harsh word and a gun, as I think Chuck Haggard says, that gives you options, and it's really all about having options. Options give you choice. Options give you freedom, right? And so that was something that I think that's maybe an advanced undergraduate or graduate degree level of gun training, and most people won't get that, but I think it's something that everybody can at least think about, right? Think about, what do you have at your disposal other than just going to the gun in the first instance. And that
Yeah.
that can bring in lots of, even if you're exonerated, right? You have to deal with the financial and the emotional costs of defending yourself. Um, or people make mistakes. You pull a draw gun, even if you don't fire it, you draw a gun on the wrong person at the wrong time. That can be costly as well. So being able to work up that force ladder, can be helpful.
I don't have it at my fingertips here, but you mentioned in the chapter your summary of Mag 40 was something like, uh, not only did I learn what needs, the things about the justifiable use of force, but I learned that I need to avoid the use of force at all costs, basically, because
Yeah,
Massad Ayoob really emphasizes the toll that it takes on you, mentally, emotionally, financially, even if you're completely justified.
yeah,
And so there are huge costs, even when you acted appropriately. So I think that's something that far too many people underestimate, is what the toll will be, even when you were justified in using force.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I feel very fortunate that like I said, the first sort of long-term systematic gun training course I took was with Moss, because he definitely has a very distinctive approach. He has a very ethical approach to the issue, and yeah, I wish I should have prepped the quote too, but it's something like, you spend 2 days learning how to use lethal force, and 3 days learning why you never want to do that.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and the other thing, speaking of Travis Haley, you were talking about tools in the toolkit. One of the things that he emphasizes, right, is that the most important one is our mind, right? He says, you say here, he it explains the motto that's prominently displayed on the wall at Haley Strategic Partners Training Lab: thinkers before shooters. And this goes back to some of the things that we were talking about earlier in the show, that the firearms training, the actual technical part about how to use the firearm effectively, is really about buying you more mental headspace so that you can think, so
Yeah,
that you can address the ethical question, so that you can address the tactical question, and other considerations. So I really, I'm encouraged that I think that a lot of the most reputable firearms trainers, I think, are taking this sort of approach about teaching people to think first, rather than acting first, and
yeah.
that runs counter, right, to the impression that's given by Shapira and Austin.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I've spent my entire life in the university. I went to college, then to graduate school, then got a job as a professor. I've done things outside the university, but I spent a lot of time around uh, educated people, or people who are educated in a certain way. And I have to say that the people who are doing the highest level gun training are some of the smartest people that I've ever met. Some of the most thoughtful people that I've ever met. They have PhD level educations in what they're teaching, and so I think this is, again, something that is not very given much credit outside of that world. I mean, people in the world probably recognize it, but I feel very fortunate to have been able to spend an hour talking to Paul Howe, or an hour talking to Mike Pannone, or 3 days listening to Travis Haley. And we probably disagree on quite a bit in our general views of the world, but I've learned a lot from them, and they're anything but people who are just telling people, you have a right to self-defense, fire away. Like, this is not what's being taught in gun culture, in any part of gun culture that I've been around.
You and I are alike in a way, in that we're both outsiders in our worldview, as it relates to things that are not firearms, to some degree, because I think of myself as a libertarian, and of course, a lot of my views about the role of government, and the role of the role that the government should play in various aspects of the world is far different than what many firearms owners believe. So to some degree, you and I are the same in that respect. But also, I'm also thankful that I actually took some of my first serious firearms training with Tiger McKee at
Hmm.
Shoot Right Firearms Academy in Alabama. He's unfortunately deceased now, but he was an excellent instructor. And he actually gave us a pamphlet from the Armed Citizens Legal Defense Network, which is an organization for which Massad Ayoob sits on the board. And so that's how I became acquainted with Massad Ayoob, was through that pamphlet that he passed out. And he basically said, you need to at least take this MAG 20 class, which is about the legal aspects of armed self-defense with Massad Ayoob. But my dad and I and my mother actually decided to attend the MAG 40 class, and I'm glad that we did. So after having some acquaintance with good firearms training through Tiger McKee, my next firearms training course was with Massad Ayoob, and I'm glad that was an early part of my, introduction to the firearms training world,
Yeah.
because, like you say, he's just an incredible, uh, I think, an incredible instructor, but also just an incredible mind. I think has a great way of thinking about problems, a great way of thinking about training and about people. So
Yeah.
I'm thankful for that as well.
And I
Um,
think I just want to add on to that, that one of the challenges I think with developing responsibly armed citizens is the cost, that I've either out of my pocket or, with Wake Forest support, have spent thousands of dollars, on gun training, and not everybody can do that. So it kind of raises the question of, how can we get the the average person who doesn't have the time or resources, or maybe even the interest in, doing a 5-day course or a weekend course, how do we get them up to a basic level of responsibility in terms of their gun ownership? And I think that we need to probably develop better ways. One of the reasons I think John Correa is so popular is because it's easy. Every day you get a 3-minute video. He's going to break down a scenario and give you some lessons from that. And so where are some of the other ways that we can bring training to the people? Um, uh, and again, might started with the first question: what's responsible? Responsible is safely using your firearms and keeping unauthorized people away from your firearms. And those are things that are cheaper to do, and that we, I think, as gun owners who know new people are getting into firearms, can, everyone teach one sort of idea.
well, I think you are a great example of one strategy, right? You take at least one class. Is it one class a semester or one class a year to the range? If you would talk a little bit about how you incorporate that sort of evangelism
Yeah.
into your teaching at Wake Forest.
Yeah, once a year I teach. For the last 10 years, I've taught a course called Sociology of Guns, and it really tries to bring the perspective that is represented in the Gun Curious book to a whole class. Most people who teach about guns in university are talking about death and injury and crime. And I talk about that towards the end, as I sort of do in the book when I talk about the risk of negative outcomes. But I really, talk about the normality of guns and gun ownership, who owns guns, the diversity of gun owners. But I start the class by taking the students to the gun range. They don't have to shoot, but they're given the opportunity to shoot 22 pistol, 9mm pistol, and an AR rifle. And almost all the students take that opportunity. Even, the most of them don't have shooting experience, but they still avail themselves of that opportunity. And that really came from my own experience going to the gun range, because I was scared of guns, and really having a good time. And, I'm not trying to convert people to gun ownership, but I do want them to say, like, hey, regardless of what you think about guns, this is how guns work. These are the rules of gun safety. Here's some basic marksmanship. Put some rounds down range, and see what you think from there. At least then, if you, you can build your views of guns based on some level of experience.
Yeah.
But yeah, 15, 16 students a year get a little bit of training in safe gun handling, and some experience safely putting rounds down range.
I love that you do that. I don't know where you got the idea. Maybe it was just an idea that you came to on your own, but I'd been listening before I became acquainted with your work. I'd been listening to Tom Gresham, who's, of course, the host of Gun Talk Radio. And he, for years, has been saying, if you want to to change the culture around guns, you have to invite people to the range. Just take, it doesn't take that much time out of your life to once a month or twice a year, whatever it is, take somebody to the range and at least introduce them to the idea that, as you say, guns are normal and normal people use guns, right? This
Yeah.
you're not necessarily encouraging them to use a firearm or buy a firearm, or just to show them what um, the culture, the practice of gun ownership is like.
Yeah. And, I think because I'm so out as a gun owner, a lot of people ask me to take them to the range, and this a lot of fun. It's a great responsibility, but it's also something that I feel like, hey, this person trusts me enough that they are interested in firearms. Let me give them a good experience, a safe experience, and I think that goes a long way. Again, not everybody is like, "Oh, that was great. Take me down to Cabela's so I can buy a gun." But a lot of them are like, "Wow, that was a lot different than I thought. That was a lot of fun." I get that a lot. The kind of cognitive dissonance of, I really don't like firearms and they do a lot of damage, but then I had fun. Now, how do I process the fact that I had fun with something that I think is terrible?
Yeah,
And that's an educational opportunity if you can get some cognitive dissonance working in someone's mind.
yeah, yeah. That's great. I love that. So we're coming up on close to an hour. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I'd like to close with a two-part question. Um, First of all, how do you see responsible armed citizens contributing to a free society? And what's one lesson that you hope people take from Chapter 8 about being responsibly armed?
Yeah. Well, I think that the gun ownership is arguably, a human right. It's at least a civil right in our society, and so having the ability to exercise our rights as humans and as citizens, that's pretty central to freedom. I think that there's ways in which the ability to use force backstops freedom or expands freedom. I think that we see this through uh, the American Revolution, for example. But then, also African Americans demanding, inclusion in American citizenship in the 19th and 20th centuries. That was backstopped quite a bit with firearms. It's a lesser known, story, but I think nonetheless an important one. Today we see a lot of, people who are sexual minorities, LGBT community saying, hey, we have rights. We need to defend our rights, and firearms are an accepted way of doing that. So, I think that the American society has never been perfectly free, but I think we're generally moving towards greater freedom and recognition of at least people's rights. You and I probably could debate about freedom in other respects in terms of government involvement in people's lives. But I think we could agree that the more people actually have and exercise the right to keep and bear arms, that the more free we are in that sense. And then the takeaway from the chapter really is from where we started, right? Don't think that just because you own a gun that you're a responsible gun owner, and that's not really like a sort of being down on people. I was not a responsible gun owner when I first owned guns. It's a plea for people to take the right of gun ownership as a serious responsibility. It's to keep yourself safe, to keep people around you that you care about safe, and to keep our society safe.
I want to just kind of provide a brief comment and see what you think about this. Is going back to the first part of my two-part question. Um, I I had a guest on, I think it was episode 40, Lawrence Reed. The title of the episode was "Are We Good Enough for Liberty?" And the idea behind this was that to have a world with freedom, or with a significant degree of freedom, we have to forge our own character. We have to be people who seek to be good people, and that sort of the impetus behind the formation of government is that people aren't good, and we need guardrails in place to guard against the bad impulses that people have, right? And so to the extent that we have more people who are responsible, that we have more people who exercise their rights responsibly, then there is less impetus for the expansion of government and the limitations on freedom. And so, uh, my view, anyway, is that by evangelizing responsible gun ownership as you do, we're also evangelizing for freedom as a byproduct, because if people act responsibly, there is less of an impetus, less of a trumpet call, so to speak, for government to take away our rights or to limit our rights. And so that I think that people should take your work seriously for that reason, among other reasons.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but that's sort of why I wanted to invite you on the show to talk about Chapter 8
Yeah.
specifically.
No, and I say, I'm a kind of not a libertarian liberal. I'm just kind of an old school, when George Bush Sr. accused Michael Dukakis of being a card carrying liberal, that's the kind of liberal I was, raised as. And less concerned about government looking at the ways government solves problems rather than the way the government creates problems. Now, being 12 years hanging around gun owners has made me a little bit more skeptical about the universal good that government could bring. And I do think that when I say, like, we need to be responsible gun owners, and then people will say, oh, so you mean we should require mandatory gun training? And I was like, no, that's not what I mean. I mean that as gun owners, we should be responsible, and we should promote responsibility among ourselves and within the gun culture. If we do that, then we can obviate those calls for mandatory training. I mean, there's reasons not to have mandatory training, lots of them. But one of them, I think, is he's sort of controversial figure in many ways, but Rob Pincus always says, rights come with responsibilities. Those responsibilities don't have to be legislated, but the more we take those responsibilities on ourselves, the less likely they'll be legislative. So I think,
Yeah.
That's to your point.
Yeah, perfect. I like that example. And Rob Pincus is a great resource. So I'm glad you brought up his name. So I want to close, and Professor Yamane, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show. But before we wrap up, if you would plug any resources, any sources where people can find out more about your work and what you're up to. I know we mentioned the Gun Culture 2.0 blog. I know you're active on X, and if you would plug those and any other resources that you'd like to point people to.
Yeah, so I'm in the process. I've had this, Gun Culture 2.0 blog since I've been doing this work, but I'm sort of transitioning towards Substack. Blogs are not what they used to be. So if you look for Light Overheat on Substack, if you look for Light Overheat on YouTube, these are some of my kind of main places that I'm putting out ideas on a regular basis. DavidYamane.com is my landing page, and you can access pretty much everything I do from there. I am in the process of following up the Gun Curious book with a book about gun culture 2.0 that I had originally intended to write before I took this Gun Curious detour. So you can stay tuned for that. But I'm also I'm writing about that this week, that gun culture 2.0 is kind of a two-edged sword, because it does capture this reality, but it also obscures the fact that people own guns for lots of reasons beyond just self-defense. And so I've kind of given short shrift to competition shooters, precision shooters, 3-gun, all those competitions, hunting and collecting. So, the Light Overheat brand now can, I think, be more encompassing of all of the diverse ways that gun culture exists in America today. And I sort of intend to press ahead with that.
Yeah, it's difficult, right? The world is so complex to simplify it into an easy heuristic or phrase. But I do like the light overheat concept about, correct me if I'm wrong, but basically shedding light and trying to foster conversation rather than just an unproductive debate or a lot of these debates online devolve into name calling, and there's no conversation actually being had. Is
Yeah.
that the idea behind it, or is there
Yeah,
something else?
a lot of anger, less understanding, and
Yeah.
so um, um, I was in Bearing Arms ran a review of Gun Curious. I was very flattered where he uh, characterized me as being like the Bob Ross of guns,
Oh, nice.
and I said that really captures kind of what I'm after. Like,
Yeah.
we can disagree about things, but let's have a civil conversation. Let's treat each other as fellow citizens who disagree,
Yeah.
and that's always the goal, is
Yeah.
to enlighten what's going on. 'Cause, it's a lot of people, they read Michael Austin or Harel Shapiro and they're just like, this guy's an idiot, like, stupid, typical, fill in the blanks. But I always say, like, look, let's engage their arguments on the ground that they've chosen, and hopefully that brings light to the situation, as opposed to just saying, I'm opting out of that conversation, right? If gun owners don't engage in those conversations, then our voices never get heard.
Well, I love the concept, and I'll certainly link to the Bearing Arms review as well. Was it Cam Edwards that wrote the review or something?
Ranjit Singh wrote the
Okay.
actual review in
Okay.
Bearing
Well, I'll
Arms.
link to that as well. And I love that example, the Bob Ross, because I hate painting, but I love to watch Bob Ross paint. So that's perfect.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Professor Yamane, so much for taking the time to join the show. I really look forward to to following your work, and I look forward to your next book. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity and for the preparation to make this a great conversation.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. And if thank you to everyone for tuning in. If you enjoyed it as well, don't forget to like and subscribe to help us spread the message of freedom. As always, you can find the episode on YouTube, Facebook, Rumble, X, and uh, on all the most popular podcast streaming platforms. We're on X at Forge of Freedom and also at forgeoffreedom.com. Thanks, everybody. And until next time, remember, you are the Forge of Freedom.